Welcome to an episode of Two Lawyers Walk Into a Bar. There's just one lawyer as a host today, two lawyers in the podcast, and it's a very special podcast. I say that all the time, every intro, but this one indeed is. I am thrilled to be joined by Nicole Aloise. Nicole is running as the Democratic nominee for the Nassau County District Attorney. The election is coming up in November, and we're going to get a little bit at the end to her campaign, but the purpose of today is to talk about her career and how she got to this point. But first, Nicole, thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me, Lee.
Well, you didn't really have a choice. Once
True.
I asked, you weren't going to say no. So just full transparency, even though we are an equal opportunity podcast where any candidate could always come on, Nicole and I have known each other for, too many years. I can't even count.
Probably about almost 20.
That is wild. I think 2008, we met each other at the Queens County District Attorney's office, which for me is a real lifetime ago because I haven't even touched criminal law in about 9 years. But for Nicole's probably a little bit closer to her memory and heart. But thanks for joining the pod today. And I guess why don't we start with you're now running in what should be a very hotly contested election for Nassau DA. But I want to kind of go back to the beginning and, talk a little bit about growing up. Did you want to be a lawyer? Did you want to do something else? Kind of what brought you to law school?
Well, I really wanted to be a Broadway star, but God had other plans for me when he didn't give me any sort of talent in that field. So lawyer was the second best that I could do.
This should, trial attorney has some Broadway components to it. So you were able to use the skill set.
That's true. And I really refrained from never breaking out into musical mid-summation, which was not easy.
Well, we'll look forward to that in the debate. So why was lawyer second choice? Was there, obviously your dad is a very accomplished judge in Queens County. Was it his influence? Was it something else?
It was absolutely his influence. He was a homicide prosecutor in the Queens DA's office in the 90s, which was no easy task, no walk in the park. And he, of course, didn't tell myself and my younger sister all the gritty details of his cases, but the intensity was certainly palpable. And we understood the magnitude of what it was he did, but he never let on that he was stressed or concerned or even upset that he had to be dealing with what he was dealing with. In fact, it was quite the opposite. He seemed to really enjoy his job, enjoyed meeting the people who he met. He loved his colleagues, law enforcement. He had a great relationship with the defense bar and with the bench, and he genuinely seemed to believe in what he did and how he did it. And that was something I always wanted growing up. I saw, wow, this is not only a cool profession where you get to do good, but you get to feel good while you do it. So the plan was law school and start at the DA's office and then go from there.
Yeah, I guess in some ways in the 90s, being a prosecutor was, in many ways was much easier than it is today, right? Without social media, the TV depiction of prosecutors is like Law and Order, or other TV shows that kind of, I think for the most part, painted prosecutors in a pretty positive light.
That's correct. Yeah, I think it was probably a lot easier there before the general public really kind of had an artistic view of what went on in the courtroom. They could really just see it as, listen, there was a crime committed, somebody was arrested, and they're presumed innocent until proven guilty, and let's go into the courtroom and figure out, what the facts and the evidence are here.
Yeah. So once you realized that you couldn't sing, was it I want to be a prosecutor, or I'm interested in law school and I'll see what happens? Well, as you're in high school and college, kind of how are you thinking about potential legal paths, or are you even thinking about it at all?
I knew for a fact it had to be in the courtroom, and definitely starting as a prosecutor. There was no other route in my mind that I was going after law school. I was going to start in a DA's office. Turned out to be Queens just because I went to St. John's, came home. I had a lot of opportunities, volunteer internship opportunities at the Queens DA's office. I felt very comfortable there, and I interviewed and I got offered the position, and it just made sense for me to start there. And then I figured in a few years, once I got my feet wet, got some courtroom experience, I'd see if it's where I wanted to stay.
So obviously it was. Other than me, What were some of the, when you started, how did you kind of realize this is the right fit for me? This is kind of what I want to make my career.
So I think that in the way that the Queens DA's office did things back in 2008, 2009, was you really jumped right in. As you know, we would handle hundreds of misdemeanor cases by ourselves at all times. We had direct supervision and then a bureau chief above our direct supervisor. But we would also be involved in the intake process, meaning from the moment of arrest, we would be involved in interviewing the police officers, the victims, the witnesses, gathering evidence, gathering facts, writing up the charging instrument, and then even going to arraignments and making bail arguments. So we really got to experience what the case was from the very beginning. And then ultimately, if that case got assigned to us, we'd see it through to either plea negotiations or a trial. I think that really drew me in immediately, because it wasn't as if, as I've heard from some of my law school friends who went into big law and firms, they spent the first few years either being an assistant, going through files, doc review, photocopying, but not us. We got right into it and experienced from the beginning. Second seating trials, second seating grand juries, being treated like how I felt I wanted to be treated as a real lawyer, and getting hands-on experience.
Yeah, sometimes astonishingly so.
Yes.
It was like maybe a little bit too trial by fire for my liking at times, but everything is relative. So you look around and you're like, oh, some people are actually like not even built to do this, and they're doing it. And if we have the skill set and are able to make cogent, capable arguments to the court, then maybe we can do this kind of work. But it did feel like trial by fire quite a bit.
It certainly did. And I think I was very fortunate to have met you very early on and to have you as my office mate, because you had been there for a year already, and your personality is so calm as compared to my chaos that I think we worked well with each other, and it was nice to have somebody else to bounce ideas off of, run our ideas past, so that we can, even though we were in it ourselves, we had some support, and that was very helpful.
Yeah, I think for people who don't know what a DA's office looks like as a younger ADA, there's it's almost like a frat in many ways, or a sorority, where you're going through you're being hazed on how to be a trial attorney. It happens really fast. It can be really overwhelming, and if you don't have that support, it can be very difficult. So I agree with you. That was critical.
Absolutely. It almost felt like being back on a college campus, where it was just people all around the same age, all just trying to figure it out together.
Yeah, 100%. So other than the kind of trial by fire and real experience that you got, were there a couple of like cases or moments in your first few years where you're like, this is really what I want to do, this is how I can make a difference? Like what stands out when you think back to your first 3 or 4 years at the office?
That's a really good question. I remember being on a DWI trial, and I remember so specifically that you go into it thinking you understand what DWI is. Somebody's driving while intoxicated, and your thoughts would immediately be they're recklessly driving, or they've caused an accident, etc. They get pulled over. The case that I took to trial, the driver was actually asleep behind the wheel in a parking space. Keys in the ignition, engine running. This is back when keys were in the ignition.
Right.
And he was approached by the police officers, and there was a lot of legal arguments to be made as to whether or not that constituted operating a motor vehicle while intoxicated. There was no doubt that he was intoxicated. That wasn't even a point of contention. Right. And I remember so clearly taking the case to trial. It's a misdemeanor trial, so there's 6 jurors. And at the end of the people's case, the end of the direct case, the judge has the option whether TOD it, or trial order dismissal, and not even let the defense put on the case, because they say the prosecution didn't even make out the charges. I remember so specifically that this judge TOD'd my case, and then for some reason heard more arguments. I was able to give him more arguments, more case law, and he changed his mind again. He un-TOD'd it and allowed the defense to put on a case. And we came back the next day, and he heard even further arguments, as if he was going to consider whether or not to let it go to the jury again. And I loved the idea that, it wasn't dead in the water. We were able to strategize. We were able to do case law research. We were able to, really argue our case in front of the judge regardless of what the outcome was. And that for me was like, oh wow, I like this. I can argue.
Yeah. And I think what's kind of a critical takeaway there for me listening to that is when you're in the weeds handling misdemeanor cases, it almost feels like you're just training, like the cases don't really have any real import. Obviously, looking back, like people's lives are in the balance. Somebody gets convicted or acquitted, it changes the entire trajectory of their lives, of other people, their friends, their family. In the DWI context, if somebody's not held accountable for what they did, they might go out and do it again, and the result might be really bad. I think being able to make persuasive arguments, understand the law, understand the facts, that there's this butterfly effect that you don't even think about when you're handling cases that could kind of change the trajectory of many, many different stakeholders in the community.
Absolutely. And I wouldn't even necessarily, now that I'm talking about this story, look at it as overzealous prosecution in the sense that I was, not giving up on trying to get this guy convicted. It was just more a matter of this is what the law is, and here's how the law applies in this case, and just making sure that everything was equitable in terms of does it go forward to the jury or not.
Yeah. Now that you brought up that example, by the way, what is like the standard nowadays with all like the keyless cars? Like so few cars have keys. So is there like, what's the key in the ignition? Just for people who don't understand, like
operating, like the
right.
engine's running. So you go in, you press the button with your foot on the brake so that the engine starts up. Not necessarily even just, you double click it from outside and it just turns the car on. It's the same thing. The operating while the operation part has to be that the car is ready to be operated. Put your foot on the gas, it goes.
Yeah. So someone like with the car on, who's like, I know we're getting into the weeds of DWI, which I don't necessarily mean to do, but you're like because we often have like this sleeping on the side of the road defense, right? Someone pulls over and they said, "Oh no, I wasn't operating the car. I was in a non-moving vehicle, and maybe I was listening to music or whatever." So, you might not even know this, but are the same kinds of defenses being posited, or has keyless like changed the way that the defense bar handles these cases?
I don't know that personally, whether or not it changes it. There was a very good Vehicular Crimes Bureau under Madeline Singis's administration. I believe it started under Kathleen Rice's and it continued under Madeline's.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's pretty decimated right now, but they had a good handle on exactly how to argue this. Those ADAs specialized in what they did, and they kept up to date on all of the laws. So I remember how vigorously they were studying and going to all different seminars and keeping up with when marijuana was becoming legal. How is this going to affect DWIs? How is that going to affect our arguments? Because while marijuana may be legal, that doesn't make smoking or driving under the influence of marijuana legal. And what are the common law signs of that? It's not as easy as drunk driving. So there were, thank goodness, a lot of ADAs in Nassau a few years ago, not anymore, but there were who were very, very good at making these arguments and understanding what the defenses were and what the appropriate either plea or maybe program or even trial would be.
So we're moving around a little bit because I did want to finish talking about your career before we got into the campaign, but since we're talking about it, I lived in Nassau County for 17 years, and then I came back, give and take, for the next 5 or 6 years, and drunk driving is obviously like an enormous part of the criminal landscape there. That's what like really impacts most every family in Long Island. For certain non-violent communities, that's the crime, DWI. We had kids in my high school who passed away as a result of it. You said that it was decimated. It sounds like that might be one of the areas that you're looking to rehabilitate if you're elected. Is that right?
Absolutely. It was a really very well-run bureau. And I'm not saying that right now there aren't still some skilled prosecutors there, but what happened was it went from a very robust program to a very decimated program. And it's not uncommon under this administration for that to have happened. I'm sure we'll get into it at some point. Right now, vehicular crimes are through the roof. The numbers are out of control, but there's not enough people at the DA's office to either keep up with it and make sure that we can get it back to a level that's acceptable for all residents of Nassau County. Because like you said, Lee, there's not a ton of violence out here, thank goodness. And for the crime that affects the most people, it is driving. It is either drunk driving or reckless driving. Yeah. And to not have a stronghold on that and to be proactive about that in the DA's office is unacceptable, really.
Yeah, I already didn't want to drive to Long Island, so this gives me another reason not to want to.
Right.
So we'll come back to the campaign in a moment, because I do want to talk more about what you're looking to change in the office. But curious to hear about, as your career went from misdemeanor to more serious felony work. Are there one or two cases or experiences that you really draw from moving forward, in your career and think about and either positive or negative? I think everybody has cases where, like, I was young, I wish I did something differently, and I can use that experience to kind of better the office and better future prosecutors, or like a good example of this went really well, and this is what I want to kind of continue to do moving forward.
So some cases that I tried while I was in Queens, I was in the Career Criminal Major Crimes Bureau. So that essentially meant that either the offense was so violent or so bad, but it wasn't a homicide, mm-hmm. or the person was such a bad criminal that they were facing life at the end of the case. A lot of the cases I tried in that bureau, the defendants were facing life.
They were recidivists, right?
They were recidivists. That's correct. So under the sentencing guideline, if they were convicted of another violent felony, it was X to life, 15 mm-hmm. to life, 20 to life, etc., because of their recidivism.
Right.
And a few of the things that I tried there, I tried some home invasions where there were children present, which were just, the testimony, those are just heartbreaking. I've tried armed robberies at stores where they rounded up everybody who was in the store and held them at gunpoint in the manager's office while the store was robbed. And one of the cases that sticks out with me a lot is, because it was very difficult, it was almost as if it were a homicide because I didn't have a victim there. The victim was assaulted in a dark alley behind his home with no eyewitnesses, only an ear witness who was inside and heard what was going on. We were able to trace back through video surveillance camera who the perpetrator was, but the victim was assaulted so badly he was left half brain dead, mostly. He was paralyzed. He couldn't speak. He had no memory. So I couldn't even call him to the stand. I had to track down his nephew, who was the ear witness, in Yemen, which was really difficult to do, have him brought here and take the stand. And it was a very circumstantial evidence case. And I liked that type of case because it was putting together puzzle pieces, and ultimately there was a conviction. The other case that I tried in Queens before I left that really meant a lot in my career was that I was the first person in New York City to use body camera footage in trial. So we really kicked the law off on how you could use the body camera footage in trial, mm-hmm. and what parts had to be muted, what parts could the jury hear.
Right. And that's obviously a huge issue these days. What about, look, I was at the office. I have very positive things to say about my time there, some negative. And I like talking about the negative. So,
yes.
You went on to Nassau and did a lot of really good work there too, as well. Between those two offices, were there one or two things where you're like, you know what, while this might be working here to some extent, like I can iterate, I can improve upon this. These are like the gaps in the office that need to be addressed by future generations, and now you're in that position. So are there a few examples of that?
I'm going to tell you about what happened when I went to Nassau, because this is really comes down to why I want to run. These two cases are it. Two cases in Nassau that were really important to me. The first one was a criminal possession of a controlled substance and criminal sale of a controlled substance, where the defendant was arrested for attempting to sell police officers heroin. Once we got the test back, it was straight fentanyl, not heroin. And he was arrested and held and charged with criminal possession and criminal sale, which is fine on its surface. I'm limited by what the bail laws are. I'm limited by what the sentencing guidelines are in New York. But one layer down underneath what happened in that crime was a family who was grieving because the night before this defendant sold those drugs to the police officers, he sold the exact same baggies to an 18-year-old kid. And just like the ones he sold to the police officers, the ones he sold to the 18-year-old kid were also straight fentanyl. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the kid overdosed, died in his room. His father found him the next morning, and there was nothing to be done about it. The family begged for justice on behalf of their son. They marched outside of the courthouse. They held rallies. They held up, life-size pictures of their son. They wanted justice for what had been done, but all I had in front of me was the criminal possession of a controlled substance. We don't have a state-level death by dealer law. However, I wanted to do more for the family. After sitting down with the parents and just seeing the mother's heartbreak, I felt just as helpless, and I wanted to do something. So I did pretty intense investigation into the defendant drug dealer, social media, cell phones, tons of warrants. And I thought I put together a pretty good example of what we could do for a manslaughter charge. I proposed it to the administration. At the time, it was the Singus administration. We sat down, we talked about it all the way up the chain, which was excellent that even the DA at the time sat down and got involved in these cases. Right. And we ultimately decided that it would be a gamble at state level for me to try and get this person indicted on manslaughter, which was, of course, disappointing for me to hear. But on the encouraging side, they encouraged me to reach out to the Eastern District U.S. Attorney's Office, who does have a federal death by dealer law, and work in conjunction with them to get this defendant indicted, which is exactly what happened. And he was indicted and he was arrested for the death of that child, that 18-year-old. And we saw it all the way through to plea. I was able to sit down in the courtroom with the parents as he was sentenced and hear what they said about how much this meant to them. So for me, being able to take a case like on surface level that could just be charged and prosecuted as it was and really do a deep dive into it to see how it could not only help this particular family, but how can we do this going forward? What kind of structure can we bring to the office so that we can make sure that drug dealers, people who are selling heroin, fentanyl, and other opioids really understand that we're taking this seriously and maybe think twice before they sell that and cause more deaths. That was one of the two cases.
Oh, you have a second one too.
I do, but
okay. I have a couple questions about this one, then we'll come back to it.
Yeah.
So has that model been replicated in the office since then, or is that something that you're looking to kind of make part of your agenda should you be elected?
So that's something that I'm looking to make part of my agenda if I'm elected. I've worked now with people who actually in the Suffolk DA's office, under Sini, they no longer work there under Tierney, but under Sini, they were able to successfully prosecute on a state level the exact same type of cases. So I've been working with them to just, figure out exactly what the parameters are and how we can develop these cases. At the same time, though, I want to make sure that my office, my administration, would be doing the strong lobbying for a statewide death by dealer law.
I love that. What I think is so interesting about that story is there's listening to the public, being responsive to the public's needs. There's at the assistant level, going beyond just what the job description is and investigating. It sounds like really well-aligned inter-office communication up to the highest level of the office, listening to the assistants and kind of giving good feedback and working for creative solutions. And then there's cross-agency functionality between state and federal agencies. These are kind of stories that I think can be missed by the public in terms of how prosecutors can handle cases. And it kind of checks all those boxes in a really compelling way.
I think it's so important that we have either cross-jurisdictional or cross-agency cooperation when it comes to prosecution, because it shouldn't be about whose name is in the headline, who gets the credit for it. It should be about who has the best resources to prosecute this case, who has the best resources to help this family, who has the best resources to make sure this doesn't happen again in the community. Right. And the fact that that administration, the Singus administration, didn't just shoot down my ideas as a line assistant and, the gangs bureau and said, oh, that's really nice that you are doing this, but these are our parameters. But they actually took the time to listen to me, help me do the research, and encouraged me to explore these charges was one of the most powerful parts of my career in making me want to move up in the ranks of the DA's office, because I wanted to see that keep happening.
Yeah. So what was the other example?
Okay, this second story is actually the reason why I ultimately left the Nassau DA's office and decided to run. So in 2021, there was a special election, and the current administration under Ann Donnelly as DA came in and took over. It was clear very early on in this administration that it was more important to have people in positions of power that would toe the party line and also just really build the DA's confidence up, not necessarily because the people who were in positions of power had the experience to be where they were. And they would start forming rules and guidelines that were, you could tell from a place of insecurity, because every time they were challenged or asked to explain, people were called insubordinate, people were fired, and ideas were shut down. I was in the Homicide Bureau at that point. I was a senior homicide litigation assistant. And when you were in homicide in Nassau, you're on call on certain days. So if a homicide were to happen on a day you're in call, you respond to the scene, which I think is a fantastic program. And because you get involved right from the beginning, you get to see it as it is. A lot of times the body's still there, unfortunately, and you get to talk to the detectives, witnesses, immediately see what search warrants need to be written, etc.
Right.
This was the unfortunate shooting of a Long Beach 20-something-year-old who was in Freeport and who was shot on somebody's front lawn. And I went to the scene. I started, working on the case. Eventually, through a lot of hard work by the Nassau County Police Department detectives and myself, we were able to patch together a case good enough for indictment. Some of the defendants we were indicting before arrest, and some we had arrested. It took a month to put the entire case into the grand jury, and ultimately
it was multiple defendants involved.
Multiple defendants involved, that's correct. Ultimately, we got an indictment on all of it. But throughout the course of investigating, speaking to witnesses, and in fact, even speaking to one of the defendants who we cooperated, it became clear that there was so much more going on with this group of defendants than just this one murder, that there were outstanding cold case murders that we weren't sure exactly who did it, and that we now are having the final puzzle pieces for because of things that they're saying that make more sense. There were non-fatal shootings. There were tons of guns being sold, drugs being sold, and there was right for a conspiracy case on this particular set of gangs. It was the Crips, the ICG Crips, who were causing havoc. We were wreaking havoc out here in Nassau County, and they were the root cause of most of the violence. So I put together, along with the homicide detectives, the gangs detectives, and some of the gangs prosecutors, a pretty solid conspiracy case that would take down this entire group. I brought it up the chain of command. Now under this new administration, there was no direct contact between me and any of the executives. It had to go up through my supervisors, my bureau chiefs, and then up through the administration. Hadn't heard anything. In about, I want to say maybe 3 weeks after I even proposed this idea, I was called into the executive's office, and I thought it was to discuss this conspiracy case going forward. And I was told, don't hold your breath. We're not giving you any resources to do this. They flat out, without any explanation, shot down this conspiracy, which would have been a made a major dent in the violent crime that was happening, with no explanation. And I couldn't take it to a higher level. There was no conversation had at all. Fortunately, the feds also found out about this, Eastern District U.S. Attorney's Office, and I brought them my cooperator. Sat down on many occasions. We built up a case on the federal level, and ultimately the feds indicted this case and are taking it so seriously that they're considering seeking the death penalty on one of the defendants. So the right thing was done ultimately, but there was no reason for it to not be a state case.
Yeah, and it sounds like it's really just from the way that you're framing it, it sounds like it's mostly a communication issue, that there wasn't the ability to communicate effectively across multiple channels. It was just one vertically integrated communication system with no bypassing the layers, and if there's like a log jam somewhere, that's kind of it. Is that kind of what you experienced?
That's certainly one of the issues. I think the larger issue, though, is the fact that, unlike the previous administration, where you worked up the chain of command, everybody in that chain of command had been in the position that a line assistant was in, had been in a position where they understood how to put together a violent felony case, how to indict a case, how to ultimately take that case to trial. And if you have that broader understanding from your own experience, it's easier to say, like, hey, let's sit down with these line assistants. Let's figure out what needs to be done here. Maybe it's viable, maybe it's not, but there's a conversation worth having because I've been there, I've been in that position, and I know what can and can't be done. This administration does not have that experience, does not have the in the courtroom sitting across from an MS-13 member while they confess to vile crimes, does not have that core experience of sitting with their arm around a family member who's grieving the loss of a loved one during a homicide investigation. And I just think it's difficult to really give the resources and the support that line assistants need if you yourself haven't been in that position.
So I guess one of the changes that you would implement is ensuring that people who are in the decision-making chain have that experience. Is that right? That's
correct. So that people higher up won't be asking anybody underneath them to do something they themselves haven't done.
Yeah. Now that we're talking about kind of differences between the current administration and what you would enact, what are like one of the two other big things that you think? We talked about the vehicular bureau. I'm sure there are other bureaus that are understaffed that you're planning to address. But outside of kind of staffing issues, what are some of the other major issues that you would make changes with respect to?
I would focus a lot on the domestic violence bureau. And there's a way to prosecute domestic violence crimes that does not re-victimize the woman, the wife, the battered girlfriend or boyfriend who are already afraid of the person who they're up against, maybe haven't called the cops the first 3 or 4 times that they've been in a domestic situation and finally did and got the cops involved. And maybe then when it comes down to it, they're too scared to talk to the prosecutor, too scared to go forward to trial. And their initial gut reaction is to want to drop the case, to want to not press charges. And as you know, Lee, if you don't press charges, if there's no case, you can't have an order of protection. And as prosecutors, it's our job to make sure that if there are real charges here, if there's real violence and a real threat, we're doing everything we can to protect that person on the other end of the domestic violence. And sometimes that means letting them say that they want to drop the charges. However, gathering enough circumstantial evidence that we can go forward with a victimless prosecution. Sometimes that even means letting the victim take the stand and testify on behalf of the defendant. Right. And not when you cross-examine her, making her feel bad or victim shaming, but just, bringing to highlight to the jury, like maybe this is why the victim took the stand in his defense. Here's some medical records. Here's 911 calls. There's all ways that we could put together a victimless prosecution that ensures the safety of the victim without necessarily re-victimizing them by making them a subject of the system. And that's something that has been lost under this administration in the Domestic Violence Bureau and something that really needs to be brought back.
Why has it been lost? What do you think is the main contributing factor to that deficiency?
From my perspective of what's going on there, it's because a lot of the experienced prosecutors who were trained in doing this type of prosecution are no longer at the office. It's staffing issues as well. So there's not as much, people power to go around to make sure that we can focus this much energy on any one particular case. And it's a little CYA at the same time. If you've got a piece of paper signed by a woman who says, I'm declining to prosecute, well then, you don't have to put that many resources towards prosecuting that case. And if anything happens, you could hold up the piece of paper and say, we gave them an option. They personally declined to prosecute.
Yeah. I think, what I'm hearing a little bit, and I don't know how that office operates at all, is losing some sense of an understanding of the fact that this is a public service institution and not a private firm that services victims. And there could be a tension there, obviously. I think from my perspective, one of the goals was always to listen to the victim as a really critical stakeholder in a case, but not be the be all end all because you're serving the public. Nobody else can. And to the DWI point before, right? The man or woman who gets out of a DWI because the prosecution is not as competent as it should be. The domestic abuser where maybe a victim isn't interested in proceeding for a number of reasons, whether it's good reasons or bad reasons. That person has not been held accountable for what he or she did. And there are other people out there who could feel the impact of that. So it sounds a little bit like it's kind of a misunderstanding that tension a little bit.
So I think you hit the nail on the head there, because the overarching theme from not only my time at the DA's office, but what I'm continuing to see both in the news and as I study the crime trends and the acquittal rates of this DA's office, is that this administration has lost sight of the fact that they are not politicians. Right. That headlines are not headlines to get you reelected, or coming out with policies now in the election year when you've done nothing about particular issues the past 3.5 years you've been in office. That's no way to run a district attorney's office. The district attorney is, above all else, a public servant. And you're right. Sometimes, and I'm sure you experienced this in your career, I certainly have throughout all different bureaus, it's hard to look a victim in the eye and say, listen, I understand that that's what you want, but that's just not how this is going to play itself out in the court system. Because when we stand up in court, we say, for the people. Nicole Aloise, for the people. And that people is not just necessarily the one person who is directly impacted by this case, but a community at a large. And you're right, even if the particular victim says, it's okay, I forgive them, I don't want to see them, either pay a fine, go to jail, go on probation, whatever the sentence is, you have to take into account, well, if we let this go, what's going to happen the next time, or to society, or if they get into a fight again, or they assault somebody again. Which is why I also think it's really important to have really good training in the misdemeanor world, to have the new line assistants really understand prosecution, because if we don't take the smaller quality of life crimes seriously and say, listen, we're here, we're in the public, we're making sure that people are held accountable for ruining things in our county, for our residents, for our high tax paying residents here, there gives them room for more of the larger crimes to move in. Once we start seeing that people don't care about, or letting things happen to their property, letting things happen to their cars, it gives criminals a little bit of an in to test the waters and say, okay, well, what can I get away with now? So I think the training program needs to be completely revamped. And I think that training program, especially now with the new discovery laws and 50A, which allows all of the police officers' disciplinary history to be turned over, I think that training has to coordinate with the police department. I think we need to bring in police officers and detectives and say, hey, listen, by law, these are the questions that are allowed to be asked. By law, this is what arguments the prosecutors are allowed to make on your behalf, etc. Because if there's not a coordinated effort here, we're just setting each other up for failure.
Yeah, that's a great point. I have one more question about just career stuff, because again, this is a career podcast. What did you have to do to kind of make the transition from prosecutor to candidate? Because you're talking about issues that you're comfortable with, right? This has been your career, so you're very familiar with the substantive piece. But now, instead of like talking to juries, you're talking to potential voters, donors, strategic partners. How did you flip a switch there and kind of prepare yourself for that? Or has that also been trial by fire for you?
It's been a little trial by fire, but what I did initially when I left the DA's office last May to run is I sat down and I thought about the district attorney's office in general on a whole, and said, okay, here's what I'm comfortable with. Here's what my experience is. Here's what I know. And I know how to fix that internally, which would translate to safer streets externally. What I don't know is much about this bureau. For example, wage theft. That was something that's never crossed my path in my career. So I made it a point as early as last May, so it's a year now that I've been doing this, to reach out to labor unions, to reach out to people in those particular fields and say, hey, I'm running for DA. This is not my specialty. It's something that I'm going to need to know everything about. Talk to me. I'm not asking, for money. I'm not asking for support. I'm not asking for an endorsement. I'm asking for knowledge, because ultimately I need to know how the entire system works, comprehensively, not just what I'm comfortable with. Right. So I've been spending the majority of my campaign not only going to different places like labor unions, etc., to find out what's important to them, but going into different communities. I'm not a lifelong Nassau County resident. I chose to move my family here for this quality of life and to be a Nassau County resident. I want to raise my children like that. I'm originally from Astoria, Queens. So I like going to all the different neighborhoods and learning about the different communities. I go to different meetings, I go to different festivals, different civic events, and saying, okay, what's important to your community? Not only when the crime happens or when you're generating a headline, but what do you want the district attorney's office to know about you, even in the quiet times, in the times when we're discussing policy or where we're allocating resources? What about your community should I prioritize? And I think that is where the public service comes in, is making people feel safe, making people feel that they have an outlet in the DA's office. They have communication. They have somebody who is thinking about them, even when it's not going to get her name in the paper.
Yeah. I mean, the really nice part about that is it just comes down to listening, right? Listening and intellectual curiosity, listening, hearing what the problems are. I think for the most part, again, because of social media, because of some like documentaries that have come out about prosecutors, the what's in the zeitgeist right now is prosecutors just going to do what they want, and they're only really interested in convictions, and that's kind of it. And so I think that what you're saying speaks to that concern, which is no, I'm going to run an office that's going to be really responsive to the needs of the community, and I'm spending the time not just campaigning, but kind of using this year to figure out what those needs really are.
I've been asked a lot recently, would you measure your success as the DA by conviction rate alone? So the fact that you just brought that up is really relevant, because people ask me that, because that's what people think based off of, like you said, the news, TV, movies. And it's just not. Yes, conviction rate is very important. And yes, criminals need to be held accountable. I made my career off of putting violent criminals behind bars, MS-13 members, gang members, lifelong criminals, recidivists. And I think they definitely need to be held responsible. But the other part of the DA's office that's lacking right now that needs to be strengthened is the community involvement. And Lee, do you remember when we were still misdemeanor assistants and we were assigned to go to a school in Far Rockaway together under the Star Trek program?
No, I don't remember that.
You have to remember that. We would go to the school in the Far Rockaway. We would talk to the class about the DA's office and what we do and our cooperation with the police department. No,
I don't. I remember.
Well, whether or not you remember it, we did it. We were partners. And we went to a school in Far Rockaway to try to get the kids involved and just understanding from an early age that, the law enforcement is not just out to get them or to, have them just when something was wrong. We wanted to make them comfortable with what we did, understand what we did, and how we really could impact and help the community. And that's unfortunately been lost. A lot of the communities I've been speaking with over the past year have said, we used to have a voice in the DA's office. We used to have a liaison. We used to be able to just call up the DA and say, hey, listen, here's what's going on in our community. And that's not there anymore. And it's so important to have that so that we can make sure we understand how each individual community reacts to crimes, receives crimes, what they want to see, and allocate the resources appropriately.
Okay, so we'll put your cell phone number in the show notes so that way people can.
You can put my campaign phone number in the.
By the way, I was kidding around. I do remember that, and what my biggest takeaway there was how excited and engaged those kids were with like the hypotheticals that we put to them.
Yeah.
But then I read stories about how, I don't want to go too far afield politically, but the defund the police movement, and when you read stories that talk about like police officers actually going into communities, how popular they are in communities that are lower income communities with higher crime rates. So I think it comes down to what's really happening on the ground versus what's the perception of what's happening on the ground. And there are bad actors in every type of profession. I think that goes without saying. But how can you be engaged with your community, every member of your community, in a way that is important to those members is such a critical part of the job.
Absolutely. And it's really on us. The onus is on us as will be on me as DA. It's on the police department to really make themselves known in the community so that they're not an entity that's to be either feared or an entity that's unknown to them.
Right.
It's on us to overcome those negative stereotypes and those negative images that you see.
Yeah. Before I let you go, we've talked a lot, but if there's one thing that you want to say to a potential voter who might not hear from you other than this podcast, for the 7 to 10 people listening right now, what is kind of that one message that you want to get across? Is there going to be a debate or no?
I hope so. I would love to debate.
Or as of today,
I'm calling for a debate, whether or not there ends up being one.
Okay. So it sounds like probably no is what you're saying.
I didn't say no. I'm just saying historically incumbents don't usually debate or don't like to. I think that a debate would be very, very helpful in this situation.
I'm happy to offer this platform as the debate forum if that's okay. But so
the one thing, my message to everybody, well, it's split into two kind of. My message is to put party politics aside. And I tell a lot of people are, as you know, very disenchanted by politics, by government right now in a lot of different ways on both sides of the aisle. And I just want people to be optimistic and say, okay, man, we've seen what goes on and we could make changes for better on both sides. We have candidates such as myself who are young and enthusiastic, and I'm not that young, but who are enthusiastic and have experience and have the energy and want to do good. Not for my ego, not for a political platform, not to see where I can get in life, but to really make a change in this particular field. So I'm asking people to really be enthusiastic, go out and tell my name to more than the 10 listeners of this podcast, and keep up with me throughout the rest of the 5 months we have running.
That's perfect. That's a great segue, which is if people want to find out more about you, hear more from you, where should they go? What should they do?
So follow me on social media at Nicole for Nassau on Instagram, Twitter, or X rather, Facebook, or go to my website, NicoleForNassau.com. You could also email me at Nicole@NicoleForNassau.com. It's all the same for all of my platforms.
Do you want to do a show tune to close out, or you want to pass?
I wish we had like the Law and Order theme song, some sort of music.
All right. Well, Nicole, this is great. Could obviously spend hours talking, but I want to be conscious of your time. So hopefully after you get elected, come back on and talk about what you're doing for the office.
I would love to. Thank you so much for having me today.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
For more on all things real estate and the law, subscribe to this and our other podcasts. Follow Bergstein, Flynn, Knowlton, and Polino on social media. Subscribe to our newsletter and go to bfklawoffice.com. That's bfklawoffice.com to learn more.